The Picture of Dorian Gray. If the face bore what the portrait should have hidden. Chapter 1. The Wish. The studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred amid the trees of the garden, there came through the open door the heavy scent of the lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. It was in this studio, in the golden London afternoon, that Basil Hallward had painted the portrait that would ruin the life of the young man who sat for it. Though ruin is perhaps the wrong word, and part of this story's whole difficulty is that no one, not the painter, not the young man, not the corrupter who watched it all, could ever afterward agree on whether what happened to Dorian Gray was a ruin at all, or something stranger and more terrible that had no name. Dorian Gray was extraordinarily beautiful. This is the fact from which everything else grows, and it must be stated plainly because the whole tragedy is a tragedy about a face. He was young, barely 20, with finely curved scarlet lips, frank blue eyes, crisp gold hair, and a look of such pure candor that everyone who met him felt they were in the presence of something unspoiled, something that the ugliness of the world had not yet touched. Basil the painter loved him, loved the look of him, which was a kind of loving the whole idea of youth and innocence and beauty, and had painted him with all the devotion of an artist who feels he has found, once in a lifetime, the perfect subject. And into this golden afternoon came Lord Henry Wotton, who did all the harm. Lord Henry, Harry, his friends called him, was a man who had made a religion of his own cleverness, who said dangerous, glittering, cynical things because he found the shock of them delicious, and who did not much care whether the things he said were true or what they did to the people who believed them. He was the serpent in Basil's garden, and he found in Dorian Gray the perfect fruit to poison, not because he hated Dorian, but because he was curious, in the cold way of a certain kind of clever man, to see what would happen if he poured his philosophy into a beautiful empty vessel and watched it fill. "You have the most marvelous youth," Lord Henry told Dorian, standing before the finished portrait, "and youth is the one thing worth having. When your youth goes, your beauty will go with it, and then you will suddenly discover that there are no triumphs left for you. Time is jealous of you, Dorian. It will take your beauty. Every month as it wanes brings you nearer to something dreadful. Realize your youth while you have it. Live the wonderful life that is in you. Let nothing be lost upon you. Be always searching for new sensations. Be afraid of nothing. A new hedonism, that is what our century wants. You might be its visible symbol. With your personality, there is nothing you could not do. The world belongs to you for a season." And Dorian, 20 years old and unspoiled and therefore utterly defenseless against a clever man's poison, listened, and felt for the first time in his life a horror of growing old, a horror of the very thing that all living things must do, and he turned to the portrait, the beautiful painted image of himself at the summit of his youth, and he was seized by a sudden bitter jealousy of it, of the painted thing that would stay young forever while he, the living man, withered. "How sad it is," he cried. "I shall grow old and horrible and dreadful, but this picture will remain always young. It will never be older than this particular day of June. If it were only the other way, if it were I who was to be always young and the picture that was to grow old, for that I would give everything. I would give my soul for that." He said it in the reckless way of the young, who do not believe that anything they say can matter. But some wishes are heard. Not perhaps by any god that the world would recognize. Dorian never knew what hurt him, and neither shall we, but the wish was heard, and it was answered, with the exact and terrible precision of a curse that gives you what you ask for, worded exactly as you asked it, so that you learn too late what you actually asked. For Dorian had wished two things, though he thought he had wished only one. He had wished that the picture grow old in his place. That was the wish he meant. But he had also wished, in his careless words, something he did not mean. If it were I who was to be always young. And the thing that hurt him separated the two halves of the wish and granted them, but not in the way Dorian intended. It let the picture stay exactly as it was, young, beautiful, unchanging, perfect forever. And it let Dorian, the living man, bear in his own face and body every mark that his soul would earn, not merely the marks of ordinary age, but the marks of every cruelty, every vice, every sin, written on his living flesh for all the world to see. The opposite of the story you know. In the story you know, the picture takes the marks and the man stays beautiful, so that Dorian can sin in secret behind a mask of eternal youth while the hidden portrait rots in the attic. Here, it went the other way. The picture stayed beautiful, and the man became the portrait, a living portrait of his own soul, walking the streets of London with his sins upon his face, unable to hide a single one. He did not understand this at first. No one understands a curse at the moment it takes hold. He only knew that he had said a wild thing about his soul, and that Lord Henry had laughed, and that Basil had been troubled, and that the golden afternoon had ended and he had gone home young and beautiful and whole, with the marks not yet begun. The marks began soon enough. Chapter 2, Sybil Vane. The first cruelty was a small one, as first cruelties usually are, and Dorian did not even recognize it as a cruelty until it had written itself upon him. He fell in love, or believed he fell in love, with an actress named Sybil Vane, a girl of 17 who played Shakespeare's heroines in a cheap theater in a poor part of London, and who acted with such genius, such transporting truth, that Dorian, watching her be Juliet and Rosalind and Imogen night after night, believed he had found in her the living embodiment of all the beauty Lord Henry had taught him to worship. He wooed her. She loved him with the whole undefended heart of a poor girl who has never been loved. She called him Prince Charming, not even knowing his name, and Dorian brought Lord Henry and Basil to see her perform, to see the marvel he had found. And on that night, the one night that mattered, Sybil Vane acted badly. She acted terribly, mechanically, without feeling, walking through Juliet as though half asleep. And the reason was the sweetest reason in the world. She had fallen truly in love with Dorian, with a real living man, and having tasted real love, she could no longer counterfeit love on a stage. The play acting that had been her whole life now seemed to her a hollow thing, a shadow of the real feeling she had discovered, and she could not do it anymore, could not pretend passion when she now knew what passion was. She told him this afterward, glowing, expecting him to be glad that his love had freed her from the prison of pretense, that she loved him too much to go on being false, even in art. And Dorian was cruel to her, coldly, completely cruel, for he had never loved Sybil Vane at all. He had loved her acting, her genius, the beauty of her Juliet, and now that the acting was gone, now that only the real girl remained, an ordinary loving girl with no genius left in her, he found her worthless, and told her so brutally in the plain, merciless words that the young use when they discover that a person they thought was a work of art is only a person. "You have killed my love," he said. "You used to stir my imagination. Now you don't even stir my curiosity. You are shallow and stupid. Without your art you are nothing." And he left her, weeping on the dirty floor of her dressing room, and went out into the London dawn feeling only relief that he was free of her. That night Sybil Vane killed herself. And that night Dorian noticed the first change in his face. He came home to his room, and there was the portrait Basil had painted, beautiful, young, unchanged, gleaming in the lamplight, exactly as it had been on the day of the wish. But when Dorian caught sight of himself in the great glass by the window in his own living face, he saw faint, but there, unmistakably there, a small cruel line at the corner of his mouth, a touch of hardness that had not been there the day before, a first small ugliness where before there had been only candor. The portrait was perfect. His own face had begun to bear the mark. He understood then, in a rush of cold horror, what he had wished, and what had been granted, and how it had been granted. The picture would stay beautiful forever, and every cruelty of his soul would show, from now on, not on the hidden canvas but on his own visible face, for everyone to see. He had wished to keep his beauty and give his ugliness to the picture. Instead, the picture had kept the beauty and given him the ugliness, the whole ugliness of his soul, written on living flesh, unhideable, growing with every sin. In the story, Dorian's first response is relief and fascination. He can sin freely, hide the portrait, keep his lovely face. In this telling, there was no such consolation. Dorian stood before the glass at dawn, the cruel new line at his mouth, and he understood that he had been sentenced to wear his soul on his face for the rest of his life, and that Sybil Vane's death was only the first small mark of what would become, if he went on as Lord Henry had taught him, a face of unspeakable horror. And he wept not for Sybil, whom he had already half forgotten, but for himself, for the beautiful face he had already begun to lose, one cruelty at a time. He resolved that dawn to be good, to go back to Sybil and beg her forgiveness, not yet knowing she was dead, to live cleanly, to erase the cruel line before it deepened. It was a real resolution, and had she lived, and had he kept it, perhaps the mark would have faded. But the news came that morning that Sybil was dead, that his cruelty had killed her, and Lord Henry came and talked, and with his glittering poison turned even the death into an aesthetic experience. She has played her last and greatest role. She died as Juliet would have died. Do not waste your grief on the ordinary when you have been given the extraordinary. And Dorian, weak, listened, and let himself be comforted, and did not go into mourning. And the cruel line at his mouth did not fade but stayed, the first permanent mark, and Dorian Gray began his long walk down into the horror of his own face. Chapter 3. The marks accumulate. The years passed, and Dorian sinned, as Lord Henry had taught him to, in the search for new sensations, afraid of nothing, and every sin wrote itself upon him. It was slow at first, and this was part of the torment. Had the whole ugliness come at once, he might have hidden himself away, become a recluse, a monster in a locked house. But it came a mark at a time, a line at a time, so slowly that he could always tell himself it was not yet too bad, that he was still, on the whole, a handsome man, that the latest small coarsening of his features might be the last. He watched his own face the way a man watches a slow flood rising toward his house, never fast enough to flee, never slow enough to ignore, always rising. The cruelty to Sybil gave him the hard line at his mouth. The years of selfish pleasure that followed thickened his features, coarsened the fine, clean lines of his youth, put a heaviness in his once frank eyes. Each new vice added its own particular mark. The years of secret dissipation grayed and slackened his skin. A betrayed friend left a shiftiness about his gaze. The ruined reputations of the young men and women he corrupted, for he corrupted many in Lord Henry's fashion, poured poison into other beautiful vessels as Lord Henry had poured it into him. Each ruin cut its own deepening line. By the time he was 30, his face was no longer beautiful at all. By 35, it was hard to look at. By 40, it was a horror, a face so marked with cruelty and appetite and cold-heartedness that strangers flinched from it in the street, that children cried, that the mirror had become a thing he could not bear to pass. And all the while in his locked room, the portrait smiled its perfect young smile, beautiful, unchanged, June golden forever, the mocking image of what he had been, and what he might have stayed if he had never made the wish, or never met Lord Henry, or never been cruel to a poor girl who loved him. He came to hate the portrait with a hatred beyond anything, precisely because it was everything his face was not. In the old story, Dorian hates the portrait because it shows his corruption. Here he hated it because it hid nothing, revealed nothing, bore nothing, because it stayed serenely, cruelly beautiful while he carried the whole weight of both their sins on his living face. The portrait had gotten the bargain Dorian wished for. Dorian had gotten its reverse. He tried several times over the years to reform. This too was part of the torment, that he was not simply a villain who sinned without conscience, but a man who repeatedly resolved to be good and repeatedly failed, and who understood better than anyone exactly what each failure was doing to his face. A man with a hidden portrait can sin and forget. The sin is out of sight in the attic, easy to ignore. But Dorian could not forget a single sin because every sin was on his face, and he saw it every time he could not avoid a mirror, saw the new mark, the fresh deepening of the horror, and knew precisely which cruelty had put it there. His face was a ledger that would not close, an account written in flesh, and he read it every day whether he wished to or not, and the reading of it, one might think, should have made him good, for what better deterrent to sin than to wear its consequences on your face? But it did not make him good. And here was the deepest thing Dorian learned about himself, the thing that would have surprised Lord Henry and horrified Basil, that even a man who wears his soul on his face, who cannot hide a single sin, who reads the ledger of his own corruption daily in the mirror, even that man goes on sinning. Because the marks, however terrible, did not touch the thing inside him that chose to sin. They only recorded the choices after they were made. He could see what he was becoming and become it anyway, the way a drinker can see his ruined liver in the doctor's chart and drink anyway, the way we can all see, if we look, exactly what our worst habits are doing to us and go on doing them. The visible ugliness was not, it turned out, a cure. It was only a witness. And a man can sin quite comfortably in front of a witness, even a witness that is his own face, so long as the thing that does the sinning lives deeper than the face, in a place no mirror reaches. Chapter 4: The Worship of the Ugly. And now comes the strange thing, the thing this whole story exists to tell, the reversal that turned Dorian's curse from a simple horror into something far more terrible and far more true. The world began to worship his ugliness. It did not happen all at once, and Dorian did not understand it when it began. He had expected, dreaded, that as his face grew hideous, society would cast him out, that the beautiful world of drawing rooms and dinners and glittering people, the world that worshipped youth and loveliness, would turn from him in disgust. And at first, for a while in the middle years when his face was merely coarsening, there was some of that, a certain drawing back, a certain whispering. But then, as his face passed beyond mere coarseness into genuine, dramatic, unmistakable ruin, into a mask of such visible suffering and corruption that no one could look at it and think it ordinary, something unexpected began to happen. People began to be drawn to him, and then to admire him, and then, incredibly, to revere him. For consider the world Dorian moved in, Lord Henry's world, the glittering world of late London society, which was a world built entirely on the hiding of the soul. Everyone in that world wore a mask. The beautiful young women hid their boredom and their cruelty behind lovely painted faces. The charming men hid their appetites and their emptiness behind wit and good tailoring. Everyone smiled, everyone was gracious, everyone concealed. It was a world of surfaces, precisely as Lord Henry had preached, a world where the great sin was not to be corrupt. Everyone was corrupt, but to show it, to let the mask slip, to be caught being what one actually was. In that world, beauty was not innocence. Beauty was the best mask, the most perfect concealment, the smooth, lovely surface behind which anything could hide. And into that world of masks came Dorian Gray, who could not wear one, whose every sin showed on his face, who walked into the drawing room bearing, openly, visibly, undeniably, the whole record of his soul, and the world, looking at him, drew a conclusion that was completely wrong and completely inevitable. They concluded that he was honest. They looked at his terrible face and they did not think there walks a great sinner. They thought, there walks a man who does not hide. There walks the one man among us who wears his soul on his face, who cannot conceal, who does not pretend. In a world of masks, here is a man with no mask. How brave, how real, how free. They mistook the involuntary for the voluntary, mistook a curse he could not escape for a choice he had nobly made. They imagined that Dorian had chosen to bare his soul openly, had refused the hypocrisy of the beautiful mask, had said in effect, I will not hide what I am, I will let you see my corruption, because I am too truthful to pretend. And in a world that was secretly sick to death of its own endless pretending, this imagined honesty was the most seductive thing conceivable. The young worshipped him first. The clever, bored young people of society, who had been taught by Lord Henry and his kind to despise sincerity and prize the surface, found in Dorian's ruined face a thrilling paradox. Here was the ultimate rebellion, the man who had thrown away the beautiful mask entirely, who wore his sins like medals, who was so utterly free of hypocrisy that he let the world read his soul in his skin. They called it authenticity. They called it courage. They gathered around him, this hideous man, and hung on his words, and imitated his weary cynicism, and told each other that Dorian Gray was the only truly honest man in London, the one man who did not lie about what he was. Poets wrote about him, about the terrible, beautiful truth of his face, the face that hid nothing, the saint of sincerity who had martyred his own loveliness on the altar of not pretending. And the more Dorian sinned, the more hideous he grew, and the more hideous he grew, the more they revered him. It was perfect. It was the most perfect trap the curse could have devised. For every fresh cruelty added a fresh mark, and every fresh mark deepened the world's conviction of his terrible honesty, so that his corruption and his sainthood grew together in exact proportion, each feeding the other. He ruined a young man's life, and a new line appeared at his eye, and society murmured about the noble suffering visible in his face, the depth of feeling, the refusal to hide his pain. He drove a woman to despair, and his mouth grew crueler, and the poets called it the mark of a man who had looked too honestly at the darkness of life. He became, in the eyes of a world drunk on surfaces and starved for anything that seemed real, a kind of holy monster, the sinner mistaken for a saint precisely because his sins showed, because in a hall of mirrors and masks the one visible face looks like the only true one. Chapter 5. Basil's Horror. Basil Hallward, who had painted the portrait, who had loved the young, unspoiled Dorian, came to him one night, years into all this, in horror at what he had heard. For Basil had heard the stories, the ruined lives, the corrupted young people, the string of catastrophes that followed Dorian everywhere. And he had also seen with his own eyes the way society now treated Dorian, the worship, the reverence, the poets and the young disciples, and he could not reconcile the two. He had come to plead with Dorian, to beg him to deny the stories, or to repent of them, and above all to understand. For Basil, alone of everyone, seemed to understand the terrible thing that was actually happening. "They think you are honest," Basil said, standing in the shadowed room looking at the ruined face of the man he had once painted in a golden afternoon. "That is the horror of it, Dorian. That is worse than anything. If they cast you out, if they saw your face and knew it for what it is, the record of your sins, and turned from you in disgust, that would be terrible, but it would be just. Instead, they have made you a saint of it. They look at what your soul has done to your face and they call it courage. They think you have chosen not to hide, when the truth is you cannot hide. The curse won't let you. And so they give you credit for a virtue that is really only a punishment. You are the most corrupt man in London and they revere you as the most honest. And the revering is worse than any punishment, because it means your corruption has not even cost you the world's esteem. It has won you the world's esteem. You have found the one way to sin without consequence, not by hiding your sins, but by displaying them so openly that people mistake the display for honesty. Do you understand what a monstrous thing that is? You have turned the visible record of your damnation into a crown." And Dorian, whose ruined face could no longer show much of anything except its permanent horror, was quiet for a long time, and then he said the thing that was the truest and most terrible thing in the whole story. "I know," he said. "Do you think I don't know, Basil? Do you think I set out to be worshipped? I wanted to hide. God, how I wanted to hide in the early years when the marks began. I would have given anything for a mask, for the smooth, beautiful face the portrait kept. I dreamed of it. But I couldn't hide, the curse wouldn't let me, and so I had no choice but to walk into the world with my soul on my face, and I braced myself to be cast out, and instead they knelt. And do you know what I learned, Basil? I learned that the world does not actually hate sin. It hates hidden sin, hypocrisy, concealment, the slipped mask. But sin worn openly, sin displayed, sin that looks like honesty, the world loves that, worships it, because the world is so exhausted by its own endless pretending that anything which looks like not pretending seems holy to it. I did not choose to be worshipped. But once I understood that my very ruin was buying me reverence, do you think I stopped? Do you think, when I found that my sins made me not an outcast but a saint, that I turned from them? I did not. I sinned more freely than ever because the last consequence had been removed. There was no longer even shame, no longer even exile, only more marks and more worship. You gave me a portrait that was supposed to bear my sins, Basil. The curse gave my sins to my face instead. And then the world, which you thought would judge my face, worshipped it. Between the two of you, you and the world, you have made it impossible for me to be punished for anything. And a man who cannot be punished, Basil, a man whose every sin is turned into either a mark he displays or a virtue he is praised for, that man is in a hell deeper than any you could paint, because he has lost the very possibility of consequence. And without consequence there is nothing to stop him, and nothing to save him, and no bottom to fall to, ever. Basil looked at him, at the ruined, worshipped face, and he understood that he was looking at something worse than a damned man. He was looking at a damned man whom the world had canonized, whose damnation had become his glory, and he understood that there was no help for it, no repentance possible, because repentance requires the recognition of sin as sin, and Dorian's sins were no longer recognized as sins by anyone, not by the world, which called them honesty, and not anymore by Dorian himself, who had learned to wear them as the world taught him, as marks of a terrible, beautiful truthfulness. And in the old story, this is the scene where Dorian murders Basil, kills the painter in a sudden rage, to silence the one man who knows the truth. And in this telling, Dorian did not need to. He did not kill Basil because Basil was no threat. Basil could tell the whole world the truth, could stand in the middle of London and cry out, "Dorian Gray is not honest. He is the most corrupt man alive. His face is the record of his crimes." And the world would only nod and murmur about the artist's touching devotion to his friend, and say that of course Dorian had suffered, that was written on his face. That was the whole point. That was why they loved him. The truth had been made harmless. Basil's knowledge could not hurt Dorian, because Dorian's sins were public, displayed, celebrated. There was no secret to expose, no mask to tear off, because the mask had become the face, and the face had become the shrine. Dorian let Basil go, that night unharmed, and this mercy was itself the most terrible thing in the story, for it meant that even the truth-teller had been rendered powerless, that there was no longer anyone who could touch Dorian at all. Chapter 6. The Untouchable Man. The years went on and Dorian Gray became the strangest figure in London. The more monstrous his face, the more monstrous his reputation, the more the world revered him. He was invited everywhere. He was quoted, imitated, adored. The disciples multiplied. And he sinned with an ease and a completeness that no man in history had ever enjoyed, because he had achieved the thing that every sinner secretly longs for and none had ever attained. Total sin without any consequence whatsoever. Not the consequence of a guilty conscience, for the world's worship had numbed that. Not the consequence of social ruin, for his ruin was his glory. Not even the consequence of hiding, for he had nothing to hide. It was all on his face, and the face was worshipped. And this, he discovered slowly, over the empty worshipped years, was its own particular and perfect hell. A hell far worse than the simple exposure he had dreaded in the beginning. For a man needs consequence. This was the thing Dorian understood at last, in the depths of his untouchable fame. He had thought in his youth, listening to Lord Henry, that the ideal life was a life without consequence, a life of pure sensation, pure freedom, in which one did whatever one wished and paid no price. Lord Henry had preached exactly this, and Dorian had achieved it more completely than Lord Henry ever dreamed, and it was unbearable. Because consequence, Dorian learned, is the thing that makes actions matter, that gives weight to a life, that makes one choice different from another. When every sin is either invisible, as in the old story, hidden in the attic, or, worse, celebrated as in his own, then sin becomes weightless. And if sin is weightless, then so is virtue. And if both are weightless, then nothing one does means anything at all. And a life in which nothing means anything is not the paradise Lord Henry promised, but a gray, infinite emptiness. a hell of total freedom. A man falling forever through a bottomless space where no action is ever arrested by any consequence, and so no action ever matters, and so the man himself at last does not matter, cannot matter, has made himself unable to matter. He longed in those years for punishment. He who had once longed to hide his sins now longed desperately for someone, anyone, to hold him accountable, to say this is wrong and here is the price, to give his corruption the weight of a real consequence. But there was no one. The world worshipped him. The law never touched him. His crimes were the subtle crimes of corruption and cruelty that no court prosecutes, the ruining of souls rather than the breaking of statutes. His conscience had been talked to death by Lord Henry and drowned by the world's applause. And his face, his terrible face, which should have been his punishment, which bore the whole record of his sins, his face had been turned by the world into a crown. There was nothing left to punish him. He had wished, long ago, to keep his beauty and escape all consequence, and the wish had been granted in the cruelest possible form. He had lost his beauty entirely, and escaped all consequence entirely, and found that the two together made a hell that beauty with consequence or ugliness with consequence could never have made. He thought about Lord Henry who had made him. Lord Henry was old now, and still glittering, still cynical, still saying his dangerous, beautiful things, and Lord Henry's face was smooth and unmarked, an ordinary aging aristocrat's face, because Lord Henry had never made the wish, had never been cursed, had only talked about the philosophy of pure sensation without ever fully living it. Lord Henry had corrupted Dorian for the pleasure of watching from a safe distance with an unmarked face. And Dorian understood at last the difference between them, that Lord Henry was a coward and a hypocrite, a man who preached the dangerous life and lived a safe one, whose smooth face hid a soul quite as corrupt as Dorian's own, and that the world, if it could have seen Lord Henry's soul as it saw Dorian's face, would have found them equally damned. The only difference was that Dorian's damnation showed and Lord Henry's did not. And the world worshipped Dorian for the showing and never suspected Lord Henry at all, which meant Dorian saw with a cold clarity that the world's whole system of judgment was worthless, that it judged only surfaces, that it had mistaken the visible sinner for a saint and let the invisible sinner go free, and that in a world that judges only what shows, the truly safe course is not to be good but to hide, and the truly damned are not the wicked but the visibly wicked. And Dorian, cursed to be visible, had drawn the shortest straw in a game that was rigged from the start in favor of the concealed. Chapter 7: The Portrait. At the very end, Dorian Gray went back to the portrait. It hung still in the locked room, as it had for all these years, young, golden, beautiful, unchanged, the 20-year-old Dorian of that first June afternoon, with the frank blue eyes and the scarlet lips and the look of pure candor that the living Dorian had lost so completely that he could no longer even remember having had it. He had not looked at it in years. He could not bear it. It was the one mirror in the world that showed him not what he was but what he had been, and the gap between the two was more than he could face. But at the end, old and monstrous and worshipped and utterly empty, he went back to the beautiful painted boy, and he stood before it, and he understood the last thing. In the old story, Dorian's portrait bears his sins, growing hideous while he stays beautiful, and at the end he takes a knife and stabs the portrait, hoping to destroy the evidence of his soul, and in destroying it he destroys himself, is found dead, old and hideous on the floor, while the portrait hangs restored to its original beauty. The knife meant for the portrait finds the man, because the man and the portrait were always one. Here there was no such clean ending, because here the portrait and the man had never shared a soul. The portrait had simply been spared, kept beautiful, while the man bore everything. Dorian could stab the portrait if he liked. It would change nothing. It would only be the destruction of a beautiful old painting, and his own ruined face would remain exactly as ruined, his own damnation exactly as complete. There was no magic knife to end it. There was only the beautiful painted boy and the ruined living man staring at each other across 40 years. And Dorian, looking at the boy he had been, understood the whole of his life at last. And it was this: that he had made the wrong wish and been granted the wrong gift and been worshipped for the wrong reason. And that underneath all three of these wrongnesses lay a single true thing that no one, not Lord Henry, not the worshipping world, not Basil, not even himself until this moment had ever seen. The true thing was that the beautiful painted boy was a lie, and had always been a lie, and that the ruined living face was the truth, and had always been the truth. Basil had painted on that June afternoon, not Dorian as he was, but Dorian as he appeared, young, candid, unspoiled. And it had been a beautiful and completely false image, because even then, even at 20, the soul that would do all these things had already been present, coiled, waiting, and the smooth, beautiful face had hidden it perfectly. That was what beauty was, Dorian saw at last. Not innocence but concealment, the most perfect mask, the surface that hides the coiled soul beneath. The portrait was beautiful because it concealed. His own ruined face was hideous because it revealed. And the world had gotten everything exactly backwards, had worshipped the concealing beauty of the portrait in its day, and then worshipped the revealing ugliness of the face in its day, and had never once in either case understood that beauty is the lie and ruin is the truth, that the smooth face conceals the damned soul and the ruined face displays it, and that of the two the ruined one is, however terrible, the only honest thing. Which meant, and this was the final, unbearable irony, the one that made Dorian laugh aloud, alone in the locked room, a horrible laugh from his ruined mouth, which meant that the world had been right in a way it never understood to call him honest. Not because he had chosen honesty, he had not. The curse had forced it on him. But because his face, alone among all the faces in London, actually did show the truth of the soul behind it. Every other beautiful face was a lie. His hideous face was the one true portrait in the whole city. The world had worshipped him for his honesty and had been correct by accident, for the wrong reasons, for his face was honest, was the only honest face there was, precisely because it could not lie, precisely because the curse had stripped him of the one universal human power, the power to hide the soul behind a pleasant surface. He was, in fact, the honest man they took him for, and he was also the most damned. And these were not, it turned out, a contradiction. He was damned and honest, honest because damned, the one man forced to tell the truth about his own soul in the only language that cannot lie, which is the language of a face that shows what is beneath it. Chapter 8: The Only True Face. He did not stab the portrait. There was no point. It was only a painting. It had never held his soul. Instead, he did something the old story never allowed, because the old story's Dorian never understood enough to do it. He took the beautiful portrait down from the wall, and he carried it out of the locked room, and he hung it in the great drawing room of his house in the most public place, where every visitor would see it, the beautiful golden 20-year-old Dorian, the perfect lying image, and beside it he hung a mirror, so that his own ruined living face would be reflected next to the painted one, the two side by side, the lie and the truth, for all the world to see. And when his disciples came, and the worshipping young, and the poets who praised his honesty, he made them stand before the two images, the beautiful painting and the hideous reflection. And he said to them the only true thing he had ever taught, the reversal of everything Lord Henry had poured into him. "You have worshipped me," he said, "for my honesty. You have said I do not hide my soul, that I wear it on my face, that in a world of masks I alone go unmasked. And you are right, though you have never understood why. Look at these two faces. The beautiful one is a painting of me at 20, and it is a lie, for even at 20 my soul was what it has since become, and the beautiful face hid it perfectly, as your beautiful faces hide your souls now, this very moment in this room. And the hideous one is my living face, and it is the truth, the only true face in London, because it is the only one that shows what is underneath. You have spent your lives perfecting the beautiful lie, the smooth face, the pleasant surface, the mask that hides the soul, and you have worshipped me because a curse stripped my mask away and forced me to show you what a soul looks like when it cannot hide. I am not honest by virtue. I am honest by punishment. But I am honest, and you are not, and the difference between us is only that my sins show and yours do not. Every one of you, if your face bore what your soul has done, would be as hideous as I am, or more. That is the truth I have to teach you, the only truth I know, that beauty is the lie, and that you are all as damned as I am, and that the only thing I have that you lack is a face that cannot pretend otherwise. And they did not understand him, of course. That was the last irony, the one Dorian carried to his grave. He had meant it as a warning, a confession, a stripping away. He had meant to horrify them, to make them see their own hidden damnation in his displayed one, to break the worship at last. But they heard it as they heard everything he said, as more of his terrible, beautiful honesty, more proof of his sainthood, the humble self-abasement of the one truly honest man, who even now refused to accept their praise, who called himself damned out of the very depth of his integrity. They wept at the beauty of it. They quoted it to one another. They loved him more than ever. And Dorian understood that there was no escape even here, that the truth itself, spoken plainly in the world of masks, was only heard as one more beautiful surface, one more lovely thing to admire and misunderstand, and that a man who has been made into a shrine cannot unmake himself, cannot climb down off the altar, cannot even confess his way free, because every confession is only reconsecrated by a world that has decided, once and for all, to worship him for the wrong reasons and will not be argued out of it. Dorian Gray died old, hideous, worshipped and completely alone, alone in the deepest sense, the sense of a man surrounded by adorers not one of whom had ever seen him, who had worshipped his beautiful mask when he was young and worshipped his hideous truth when he was old, and had never, in either case, understood a single true thing about the soul behind either face. He was buried with great honor. The poets wrote elegies to the saint of sincerity, the man who never hid his soul. And in his empty house, the beautiful portrait hung on beside the mirror that no longer reflected anything, the lie beside the place where the truth had stood, and no one who came to the estate sale understood why the two had been hung together. And someone bought the beautiful portrait for a good price, admiring the frank blue eyes and the look of pure candor, the perfect image of unspoiled youth, never dreaming that it was the falsest thing ever painted, the mask that had hidden everything. The beautiful lie that the world would always, always prefer to the terrible, honest ruin of a real human face. For the world loves a beautiful lie and flinches from an honest ruin, except, sometimes, when the ruin grows so complete that the world mistakes it for a different and more comfortable thing, and kneels and worships and thereby proves, one final time, that it never wanted the truth at all, but only ever a new and more thrilling surface to adore. The end.